I want to welcome back all of you who've been part of our World Food Day program so far this morning, and a warm welcome to all who are just joining for our next session, which will start at 11 o'clock Central Time promptly. I wanted to draw your attention to one of the things that you probably saw when you were registering or joining. We are really pleased to be able to bring this program to everybody around the world free of charge, but we also made a suggestion that if you can, world food needs are tremendous, but also hunger at a local level everywhere is a serious problem. We've been hearing about that. And there's opportunities to click and make a donation if you can to the World Food Program for global. Second Harvest Heartland is one of the local kind of backbones for all of our different kind of food banks and other food programs, or just to somebody locally. We just want to make that a possibility for those of you who are enjoying this program today. We're able to bring this to you free of charge because of our very generous partners, our program partners, the World Affairs Council of America in their partnership with the World Food Program USA, and our sponsors who've made today's specific program really possible. Hormel Foods and King Solution, McKnight Foundation, the Regenerative Agriculture Foundation, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Greater MSP, but of course, all of our members, those of you who support us every year with your membership contributions. You make this and all the other things we do throughout the year possible. And if you're watching today and you want to be part of our Global Minnesota family, please take a moment. Down in the YouTube channel, there's a little box at the bottom description. It'll give you a link that can take you to a website where you can get additional information, find out about membership, but also just to see the kinds of programming that we're able to do. I mentioned that we've partnered with the government of Belgium to bring a big exhibit, which is now on display at the Mall of America, up on the 3rd floor if you happen to be there, in the North Atrium by the food court. It's letters from the children of Belgium to the children of America, thanking them for saving their lives during the First World War and right after, with the food relief that came from our region, from our flour mills, from our farmers. And that kind of program where we did a big opening and we brought in speakers from Belgium and from the United States and from the families and all the people involved, including direct descendants of James Ford Bell, who was the founder of General Mills. That's available in our archive, on the YouTube archive. I think it's being edited and it'll go up, but you can see the range of programs by going and checking out both the website, but also the YouTube channel. And so today we were very, very excited to bring into this program the Director General of the United Nations International Labor Organization, which in fact is the oldest of the specialized parts of the UN system. It grew out of that First World War where there was so much famine and hunger and just such horrific violence and so much maiming and just human tragedy throughout Europe and other parts of of countries around the world. And International Labor Organization was born in 1919 in the wake of that destructive war, because there was a vision that we had to do something. We had to address some underlying conditions, human rights violations and oppression, and we had to do that in a multilateral or in a global way. And so the International Labor Organization was born, and it was unusual because it created what they call a tripartite. You'll hear more about this, about where labor and workers and businesses and companies together with governments began to say, we have to find new ways. We have to promote human rights. We have to promote decent employment. We have to promote the protection of people's lives at work in the community. And so I was very thrilled to be able to invite and very grateful for his agreement, the Director General of the International Labor Organization, who's joining us this morning in Minnesota from Geneva, their headquarters. Guy Ryder is the Director General. He will actually be joined also by partners from the labor movement and from the Council, the U.S. Council of International Business, and Kevin Cassidy, who's the director of that International Labor Organization office in the United States, and he's the representative to the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, World Bank, et cetera, and other multilateral organizations. Guy Ryder joined the International Labor Organization in 1998 as a director of the Bureau of Workers' Activities and was that Bureau's Director General. And during that time, he really worked heavily on the decent work agenda and launched a lot of initiatives in the global community. But it brought him back there in 2010 to become the executive director in charge of labor standards. And then in 2012, he was elected to be the Director General and reelected 2016. He's someone that has incredible international support, leading one of the most important agencies and institutions that we have. I'm so thrilled to welcome and greet Guy Ryder, handing the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I hope you can hear and see me. It's a real pleasure to be taking part in this event, and I want to thank Global Minnesota for bringing us all together. Let me say firstly that opportunities to link up international organizations such as ours with local state actors are all too rare, and I think we need to take advantage of all of them. And what better opportunity than on this, the 75th anniversary of World Food Day. It gives us a terrific opportunity. And this, of course, coming just after our colleagues at the World Food Programme got the Nobel Peace Prize. And I know we'll all want to join together in congratulating David Beasley and his team for that wonderful recognition. And I'm really pleased, let me say at a personal level, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to interact with friends from Minnesota. You remind me of my one, and I'm afraid only visit to Minnesota. It was quite a long time ago, I have to say. I went up to visit the Iron Range to see working issues on the Iron Range up there in the north of your state. It was a memorable visit. I learned a lot. I also learned that it gets extremely cold in Duluth in December, and the memories of that, the climatic conditions have remained with me. Anyway, great to be with you. Let me just say a few words about the International Labour Organization. I don't want to miss the opportunity to make us better known to all of you over there. As was said by Mr. Ritchie in the introduction, we're 100 years old, last year actually. We predate any other part of the international system. We predate the United Nations, but we have subsequently become a specialized agency of the United Nations. And the basic idea of the International Labour Organization, and you'll get the clue really from the fact that we were set up immediately after the First World War with Woodrow Wilson playing a key role. The basic idea is to avoid conflict, to preserve peace. You need to promote social justice. And to that end, you need to look after people at work. You need to ensure that people have decent working conditions and are able to make a decent living from it. And we've got this incredible, I think, peculiarity of the International Labour Organization, and you'll see it in action after I finish my few comments. We bring together not just the governments of the world, we bring together the employers' organizations, the business community on one side of the table, and labor and trade unions on the other. And they're not just invited to the organization, they are members, they have a full role in decision-making in our organization. And that makes our organization a really interesting, sometimes difficult place to be, but it's very seldom boring, let me say that. And one of the things, and I'm going to finish with this on the ILO, one of the things that the ILO does, and probably we're best known for, is we negotiate together every year on a global tripartite basis, these three groups together, international labor standards, conventions and recommendations, which are effectively the international rules of the game when it comes to labor matters. And when those conventions are voluntarily ratified by our member states, they become binding in law. And that's an important point to make. I have to say the United States is not the most enthusiastic ratifier of our conventions, but we can hope we can encourage you to greater efforts in that regard. Now let me turn my attention to food issues. You might at first sight say, well, you know, food's really important, it's World Food Day, but what has the ILO and this gentleman from the ILO really got to tell us about food? Well, I think we have to just take a moment to consider just how intimately connected food security, the right to food, which is recognized at the international level, how intimately all of that is linked to the work that we do and what we get from that work. Now, let me just remind everybody that despite the recognition of the right to food in international law, we are in a situation in the world today, and I'm speaking of before COVID-19 took hold, of 690 million people who suffer from chronic hunger, 2 billion people who have hidden malnutrition. And I think the first question all of us should be asking ourselves, you know, wherever we live, is how is this possible? How is it possible in a world where we do have the capacity, notwithstanding planetary limits, notwithstanding the pressures of population growth, we have the capacity to feed and ensure the proper nutrition of every person on this planet. It just doesn't happen. Why? Well, obviously, and this is a natural thing for us to do, isn't it? We point to situations of natural or man-made disaster, be it famine, be it war and conflict, and say, well, you know, this is where hunger comes from. And of course, it does come from such situations, people in extreme vulnerability. And, you know, we think of the Yemen, for example, where we see, frankly, hunger being used as a weapon of conflict and war. And we know that we have an extraordinary humanitarian and peace-building job to put those situations to an end. And, you know, our task, painful as it would be that much easier if the existence of hunger and malnutrition in the world was attributable only to these situations of natural and human disaster. But, you know, that isn't the case. There are structural issues, and I suspect others have spoken to you in similar terms as I'm about to do. There are situations, structural problems in our food production and distribution systems which make hunger an unfortunate, unwanted, but widespread byproduct of the way we handle food in the world. The point I think I want to make is that it's not simply about stocks and existence of food, it's about how it is distributed, and it is how people have or do not have access to food. And what I want to say to you is that is intimately linked to the way people work and what they get for the work that they do. Now, it seems to me, as we head to the next World Food Summit, that to put together a genuinely effective strategy to counter hunger and malnutrition in the world, we have to bring together a whole range of policy issues and a whole range of actors. Foremost amongst those actors are the business community and organized labor side by side with government. We have to bring the science of food production to play, agronomy and everything that goes with it. We have to bring those who are concerned with land holding, land tenancy, land use. We have to bring trade policy issues into play. We know that the current arrangements for trade policy, agricultural subsidies and the rest of it is vitally important as well. And we have to think how global supply chains in the food industry operate. You know, food starts with that point of production, agricultural laborers in the fields, it goes through to the processing process, and it goes right up to those retail workers who are at the point of sale. These are complex processes, and they are processes which bring unexpected and sometimes entirely illogical results. Side by side, and I'm sure this has been mentioned before, with hunger and malnutrition, we have the problems of obesity, don't we? And there is something strange about a problem of obesity, which is by and large associated with the rich in poor countries and the poorest in rich countries. And we have to unravel those realities and think what we must do about them. But let me focus a little bit now on the situation of people who work in the food chain. And of course, their numbers vary greatly according to the economies in which they work. My figures are that in the United States, those in food and food processing amount to about 11% of the workforce. Go to sub-Saharan Africa, go to South Asia, and you're 60% plus as the figure that applies. Now, what are the problems? What are the issues that they face? Well, a large proportion of those whose job it is to produce food, the growers, the laborers, the people whose job it is to produce food, very often can't afford and can't have access to enough food to keep them healthy. And so we have to start our thinking with the circumstances of agricultural and rural workers in the world. Very large numbers of them work in informal settings. The global figure is that 60% of workers worldwide work in informality, and they are highly concentrated in the agricultural and rural economy. Regrettably, child labor, there are still 152 million child workers in the world, heavily concentrated in agriculture. Forced labor, still 25 million forced laborers in the world, a lot of them involved in food production. These are the issues that I think lie at the sometimes hidden end of food production and which we all need to address. But then you have to look at situations of rural economies in national economies. We have to work out the ways to make domestic supply chains work better. We have to do things to make working in the rural economy not second best as it is perceived as being in so many countries. That's why you get the very high levels of rural to urban migration that we see in the developing world. We need to make working in the rural economy a really viable and attractive proposition, particularly for young people. That is rarely the case today. Then we have to look at basic issues of safety and health in the rural economy. Hazards in the agricultural sector vary from familiar issues of musculoskeletal problems, exposure to harmful chemicals, heat stroke, but they also include snake bites and issues such as that. So an enormous range of issues that we have to look at. And I think my last point in this regard is that in very many of our member states, agricultural workers, rural workers are treated differently from other workers under the law, labor law of the land. Now, the ILO doesn't think that there is any justification for making a particular distinction, particularly in respect of the exercise of basic rights. Agricultural workers have the same rights as everybody else, but that is not always acted out in practice. So these are some of the issues I think that we need to address as we tackle the wider issues of food security on this World Food Day. And let me finish, and I will not go further, by just making a couple of remarks about how COVID-19 has impacted on what is an already pretty difficult situation in respect of food and work connected with food. We have seen that COVID-19 has devastated the world of work. By our calculations, COVID-19 has led to the destruction of jobs to the equivalent of 495 million full-time jobs around the world. That is a volume of work which has ceased to take place as a direct result of COVID-19 and its economic and social consequences. That means that labor income has gone down by about 10.5% worldwide, and people at the bottom of the labor market stack, as it were, are those who have to spend a very high proportion of their income on eating, on food. And now they're often not able to do that. Informal workers with no social protection often face the choice of going out to work in defiance of medical protocols or not eating, and their families don't eat that evening. And it's why David Beasley, and I'll finish with him, the leader of the World Food Programme, has warned us already that this global health emergency, which has already provoked a dramatic economic and social world of work crisis, runs the risk that the next pandemic is going to be a pandemic of hunger. And none of this is going to be solved. None of this is going to be addressed satisfactorily unless we all pull together as a global community. We are faced with a global emergency. It is an illusion, I am afraid, ladies and gentlemen, to believe that any actor nationally, any actor in terms of where we stand in the world of work is going to be able to construct satisfactory responses. All hands need to be put to this task. That means international cooperation well beyond what we're seeing today, be it in the development of vaccines, be it in the provision of support to the developing world. We need it more than ever. And the unfortunate truth is, right now, today, there is not enough of that solidarity, not enough of that cooperation in evidence. And I hope that we can help to change the climate in that regard. Thanks very much for listening to me. I hope I haven't taken too much time. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Director General. And I think we'll move now to your DC office. And we're very, very grateful to be able to support and have this session today. And you brought out a lot of the deeper issues we were very, very interested in. Thank you. Kevin Cassidy, please take the mic.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to the Director General for joining us today with a very busy schedule. The next part of this program will be a Q&A session with what we call the social partners of the ILO. This is the workers and employers. I'll introduce them first, and then I would ask Cathy Feingold to make the presentation, and then for our other colleague, Gabriella Rigg-Herzog. Cathy Feingold is the director of the AFL-CIO's International Department and the deputy president of the International Trade Union Confederation, which is an organization representing 200 million unionized workers worldwide. Cathy brings more than 20 years of experience in trade, global economic policy, and worker, human, and women's rights issues. In 2020, Speaker Pelosi appointed Feingold to the Independent Mexico Labor Export Board, the body created under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement to monitor and evaluate labor reforms and worker rights compliance in Mexico. Her work in both global and grassroots fora reflect her commitment to strengthening the voice of workers and people in the global policy debates. Welcome, Cathy, to you, and I will give you the floor at this time.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you, Director General Ryder, for those important words. Today, it's really fitting to celebrate both World Food Day as well as the World Food Programme's Nobel Peace Prize, because it really recognizes the contributions that the World Food Programme makes for working people around the world, and we're really grateful for that. As we celebrate the World Food Programme and World Food Day, we come together to really also celebrate Global Minnesota's work. So thank you, Mark, to you and to your wonderful staff for the vision you had in putting together this program and for the work you do every single day for working people. We are living in a time of intertwined crises. We've got economic inequality. We've heard about the health pandemic. racial injustice, attacks on democracy. And I know everyone in Minnesota has been part of these intertwined crises, as well as all of us here in the US and around the world. It's a time of extreme challenges. It's also a time of extreme opportunities. We have opportunities to rebuild our economy in a way that puts food security, the Sustainable Development Goals, worker well-being, and the environment at the core of any recovery. We need to see the Sustainable Development Goals that were created by the United Nations, not as individual targets, but as a set of interlinked and complementary policies that create kind of a roadmap for us to tell us where should we be going today. As we commemorate World Food Day, I think of all the ways workers are part of this day, from planting to producing the food, selling the food at grocery stores and restaurants. And unfortunately, due to the pandemic, workers across all sectors are experiencing growing food insecurity. A forthcoming Worker Rights Consortium survey, based on hundreds of interviews across garment producing countries, finds a crisis among garment workers whose wages were terminated when consumer demand plummeted during the crisis, and now they face extreme food insecurity. So for the labor movement, our message for World Food Day is that there can be no food security without worker rights and protections for all food and agricultural workers. Far too often, essential workers have been considered expendable in the global economy. We have got to change that model. The pandemic and today's focus on World Food Day reminds us that we should consider that we have the opportunity to change the model that has kept so many workers in this situation of abusive worker rights as well as food insecurity. We can make a change. In the US, we've continued to raise concerns regarding the current crisis on food workers. Meatpacking workers have been placed in the category of essential for their role in maintaining functional food supply chains, but many of them are at risk of food insecurity themselves. Here in the US, without a national emergency health standard creating one framework for health and safety practices across all workplaces, almost 45,000 meatpacking workers have been affected with COVID, and over 250 have lost their lives. And instead of increasing protections, some employers and politicians have actually blamed the workers for the outbreaks. We've seen an increase in racist attacks targeting migrant meatpacking workers, including arguments that migrants, they're not like us, they live in crowded and unsanitary conditions. We must reject that kind of rhetoric and make sure that all workers, migrant workers, the most precarious workers, receive the same rights and protections as all workers. And the situation for farm workers producing our food has been no better. With the shutdown of restaurants, schools, universities, corporate cafeterias, American farms have scrambled to find alternative ways of getting produce to markets. Prices have fallen by 20 to 30%, and workers have been hit correspondingly. And the mass layoffs of farm workers resulted in another layer of crisis for those on temporary visas, known as H-2A visas here in the United States. We know that this is a situation that has faced migrant workers around the world in different visa categories. At least 150,000 agricultural workers in the US have been affected by COVID. And since the data that we have excludes temporary and contract workers, we know the number is higher. And finally, those cafeteria workers that kept us all fed in our workplaces, they feed us in stadiums and universities and corporate cafeterias. They have been furloughed and face their own precarious situation. Their jobs remained really precarious, part-time, few or no benefits, and often little to no training in how to do the job safely. So now we know there's a lot of challenges, but I also mentioned at the beginning, this is a moment of opportunity. We absolutely know that we cannot go back to this model where farm workers' rights have been excluded from US labor law, have been excluded from many laws around the world, where migrant workers are not receiving the same protections. We can change all that right now as we think about what kind of recovery packages and what kind of economic models we need to rebuild to make sure that our model is rooted in protecting the rights and well-being of workers and of the environment. So first of all, we need a trade union and human rights-based approach for agricultural and food workers to be the basis of any global food security policies. This means that all workers must be recognized as essential and critical workers for global food security and for resilient food supply chains. All worker rights should be respected. When workers feel like they have a voice at work, they can make sure they're working in a safe workplace. When workers feel like they're protected to say, hey, sanitation in my workplace, knowing there will be no firing because they're speaking out, that will make sure we have safe workplaces. Agricultural and food workers, including migrant workers, must have the same labor and human rights as workers in all industries and commerce. And we must recommit to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals that provide that important framework for building food security and economic and social justice for all workers. I am confident today on World Food Day that we can build this new model together. The labor movement is ready to do it, and we look forward to working with all of you. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Thank you very much, Cathy. That's wonderful, and we'll get a little bit more deeper into those issues in just a moment. At this time, I'd like to invite my colleague Gabriella Rigg-Herzog from the U.S. Council for International Business. Gabriella is the Vice President of Labor Affairs and Corporate Responsibility for USCIB, and Ms. Herzog leads USCIB's work on labor and employment policy, corporate responsibility, business and human rights, and corporate governance. USCIB itself advances the global interests of American businesses, both as a member of the ILO and through its membership in the International Organization of Employers. Gabriella, prior to joining USCIB, worked as the Corporate Social Responsibility Officer at the Hess Corporation, where she had developed and integrated the key CSR and human rights governance, employment training, and assurance processes into their management systems. Gabriella also has worked in the U.S. Department of State and the Department of Labor. Gabriella, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you so much to today's organizers, Global Minnesota. It's a prestigious event that you've developed. Your agenda over the course of today to celebrate World Food Day. You've got a wide-ranging panel and group over the day of leading experts from a range of disciplines, and I'm very proud to have USCIB be included today. I also agree with the remarks that Director General Guy Ryder gave about what a great opportunity this is to participate in a conversation that's connecting the global with the local, as Global Minnesota does on a regular basis. Thank you. Just quickly about the U.S. Council for International Business. We're a business membership association with an active membership base of some 300 multinational corporations, law firms, and business associations. Like Global Minnesota, the core connecting point among our members is that they're globally focused, operating internationally or sourcing internationally across a range of sectors, including agribusiness members as well. We're a policy-focused organization, and we follow global policy developments through our standing in key international bodies, including the International Labor Organization. So within the ILO, we represent U.S. employers and have a seat on the ILO governing body as well. USCIB covers a range of policy areas. I cover labor and employment, but I do have a colleague, Mike Michener, who covers food and agriculture, and he follows a lot of the issues that we're discussing today very closely. I want to join everyone in celebrating World Food Day today and the founding of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Its mission, which in its founding is the same and with even more importance today. And this year's theme, the 2020 theme for World Food Day of Grow, Nourish, Sustain Together is incredibly relevant. Of course, today since the beginning of the year, we've all been operating in a very unique context with COVID-19 and the global pandemic. And that colors a lot of the discussion about food security and and development and agriculture that we're discussing today, the pandemic has had devastating impacts, first and foremost, obviously, from a health perspective, but also economic and livelihoods with countries, economies, businesses, and families and individuals all impacted equally. And as a result of especially the livelihoods impacts, we have nutrition concerns as well, and very worrying statistics, not only from the World Bank or the OECD, but even at state levels in Minnesota, you're well aware of increased nutrition scarcity and vulnerability of many around the world. So in terms of a response, certainly there's short-term opportunities, infusion of short-term economic support for families to be able to have access to resources to get the food they need to sustain their families. Shoring up social protection systems as well is a policy area that we've certainly advocated for, especially at the global level, but also domestically as well. I mean, the need for individuals during this transition, during this scenario, to be able to have access to unemployment insurance or health benefits, or just infusions of short-term liquidity for small businesses to be able to maintain themselves, to be able to continue to produce the food and employ the very key frontline workers, to be able to facilitate that connection between the food providers and the recipients. Longer term approaches, though, are critical, and that's going to cover a broader range of policy issues, including core areas like education policy, skills development policy, as well as tackling some of the deeper rooted issues Ryder talked about, informality. The majority of the world's workers are in the informal sector, where some of the biggest challenges regarding decent work are prevalent. As we together look at policy responses to the food crisis and the need, the perennial need for greater access to food and nutrition, the key for us is inclusive approaches, be it at the local level or at the multilateral level, but inclusive approaches that bring governments, businesses, civil society, university sector, academia together, bringing that knowledge together for shared solutions. And I thought the launch earlier today of the MBOLD, the Minnesota MBOLD Coalition, which brought together businesses, universities, and civil society to address, as my understanding is, future of food and agriculture in ways that nourish the growing population, but also protect and preserve Earth's natural resources, is an example of an inclusive approach responding to a key critical need that is one that we should look to with support and hopes for replication going forward. Maybe I'll just touch on an example of this type of inclusive approach and the partnership model that's so key for successful responses, by mentioning an initiative at the U.S. Council for International Business that we recently launched, Business Partners for Sustainable Development. It's an initiative of our foundation, and it's a virtual center that establishes a framework for government, business, and civil society to share information, resources, activities, and capabilities. The objective is to facilitate partnerships on key issue areas like global nutrition and malnutrition, and find creative solutions that can be optimized. And in a recent example, and I'll conclude with this, Kevin, and look forward to the discussion, our foundation teamed up with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN, to organize two public-private partnership dialogues on the issue of how to address and tackle malnutrition And this work, these dialogues led to the development of a set of 7 principles for engagement between governments and businesses to improve nutritional outcomes through public-private partnerships. And this work is being advanced to donors and key development agencies, foundations, and companies interested in advancing this work, and will also be furthered at national levels, but with a slightly delayed timeline because of course, COVID overlays and the need to wait until we can do those dialogues in person on the ground. So that's just an example of the importance of and value of inclusive approaches, partnerships, and dialogue at the multilateral system level and locally as well. And thank you so much.
Gabriella, thank you very much for that. So now we'll go into the Q&A component segment of this discussion. And I think the question I think on everybody's mind right now is on COVID-19, about how these essential workers, becoming essential workers, are poorly paid and working in difficult conditions, and so maybe not having the right protections. And so first to Cathy, what are you seeing out there, and what is AFL-CIO and the other affiliates doing to assist people in this difficult time?
Thanks, Kevin. We see that there's a tremendous crisis. And, one of the first things that we said during this crisis is our country needs an emergency temporary health standard. We asked the Department of Labor to do that. We actually had to have a lawsuit filed because we weren't getting the needed government regulation on this. Without that framework, what's happening is they're having to do it state by state. So we saw today the governor of Michigan coming out with a new order around protecting the health and safety of workers. We've seen Virginia enact an important piece of legislation. But what we really should be seeing is one framework so that employers know, what do we need to do to have good, healthy workplaces? So that's one important thing during this crisis. The other crisis is absolutely giving workers the protection they need. We've been trying to support a renewal and expansion of what was the CARES Act, which is now being called the HEROES Act. In our country, workers have been on a cliff for a while. They have no more income support. We're seeing in Europe different models where income support programs are continuing. We need ongoing support for all workers, migrants, agricultural food workers, any worker who has been impacted by COVID should get income protection. And then lastly, obviously, all workers should have access to free testing and to healthcare protection. So that is the immediate, and although it sounds pretty basic, in our country, we are still struggling to get these fundamental issues created.
Yeah, if I can maybe take that a little bit further with Gabriella, behind closed doors, if I may push you a little bit about the business community, what are their major concerns? Obviously, price point is very important in the U.S. market. If you are getting better protections or improving the health care that these workers are having, what are businesses' concerns, and how is USCIB advising them?
Well, first and foremost, it's a health crisis. I mean, we're all in this together. I mean, COVID-19 does not discriminate. It doesn't care where you're located around the world or your economic status, irrespective. And so from that perspective, first and foremost is a health crisis. I mean, we need to focus on getting the vaccine. I've certainly aligned myself with those who feel like if we want to be able to get the economy, the global economy going again, is so that families can get back to work and have I mean, we're talking about food and nutrition today, right? So families can get back to work to have the resources to supply the nutrition needed for their families. We need to be healthy. We need to be able to count on a vaccine, but there's a lot of concern and some funny information out in the world about whether or not the vaccine will be safe. They're already prior, there's kind of a global discussion, unfortunately, about vaccines. So as an example of one of the initiatives that we're undertaking at USCIB through this Business Partnerships for Sustainable Development development I mentioned is in collaboration with Wilton Park and with our global affiliations like the International Organization of Employers and the International Chamber of Commerce. We've launched something called Convince, which is a public-private partnership to advance information, credible information about vaccines and their safety with and we'll seek to mobilize and leverage our global networks of the business community to be able to communicate with transparency and with authoritative and solid information about vaccines when they come out and what can be expected and their reliability, so that together we can try and get as many people vaccinated as possible once that cure comes forward. And health, again, is at the core of our recovery. So that's just an example of a concern that we're trying to address through a public-private partnership.
Cathy, you were talking a bit earlier about migrant workers. We know that migrant workers are in many ways the backbone of the agricultural sector in terms of picking or planting and weeding. And so, you know, what challenges do we face currently? What would the AFL and again your affiliates advise and to sort of de-escalate people's maybe misperceptions, maybe giving a clearer picture about what that actually means?
Thank you, Kevin. I guess I would start by saying, although, you know, everybody is experiencing the pandemic, it does discriminate. And what we're finding is certain communities are disproportionately impacted, and migrant and communities of color in the United States have seen a, you know, huge impact compared to other communities. So I do think this is an issue about inequality, about frontline workers, about communities of color that have been disproportionately impacted. For migrant workers, I think one is the issue I talked about, you know, the threat of the visa categories. In the US, labor law protections, they don't receive the same labor law protections, so we need labor law reform. But at the actual workplace, because I think that's where we really need to be looking, I mean, before even vaccines happen, what's happening today to the person that is, you know, picking our berries or our lettuce? We need to make sure they have clean water. They have proper access to sanitation. They physically distance. They have places where they can sleep in their quarantine. The Farm Labor Organizing Committee, one of the affiliates of the AFL-CIO, has actually developed a model so that when workers coming from Mexico come for the agricultural work here in the United States, temporary work, they're living in places that the union has ensured is safe, right? So that they're not all in a close quarter, but there's quarantine, there is plexiglass in the needed places, there's soap, there's sanitation. So the role of unions, making sure that those workers can have a collective voice, they can speak out without fear of saying, you know, you're gonna be deported or lose your job, is so critical during this pandemic.
Very good. You know, when we start thinking about supply chains, whether they're domestic or global, obviously looking at those inputs that come in, and Gabriella, you know, we actually the other day we had a discussion about, for example, the Harkin-Engel protocol about chocolate, and so you know, what is the business community thinking about this? Do they feel besieged by these human rights specialists, or do they really empathize and understand that it's a part of the business model, and we need to work together on this?
Well, if I'm understanding the question correctly, and with today's theme in mind about food and agriculture, you're talking about the connections between global corporations and production overseas through supply chains. And in that regard, I'd say not just for food and ag, but across the board, especially with the advent in 2011 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which offered a global framework on the role of government and the role of business on human rights. There's a clear understanding about the responsibilities of business to carry out their work with due diligence and with respect for human rights, and that includes with business relationships. So there's decades of practice, which is always evolving and advancing and improving, of working to use the leverage that those business relationships have to be able to seek to advance these rights, especially in places around the world where rule of law is not where we would want to see it. The ILO's own data shows that the overwhelming majority of decent work deficits, if I could use the ILO language, but the challenges that we don't want to see, the child labor, the forced labor, health and safety, wage and hour concerns, the ILO's data shows that the overwhelming majority of those cases are at the domestic level. So Director Ryder mentioned domestic supply chains, and I believe that came up in the context you're mentioning regarding cocoa as well. But the Cathy's noted challenges and opportunities. I mean, this is a shared concern for all of us who care about the advancement of human rights and labor rights around the world. We've got to figure out how to better engage these national level producers who aren't tied to global supply chains, but they represent the majority of production and the majority of work in the world, but they're producing for national consumers or neighboring consumers where unfortunately, the expectations are not what we would want them to be with regards to labor and human rights. So that's a big nut for us to work to crack. A lot of the overlay there has to do with informality, as I mentioned earlier. But the informal sector is outside the umbrella of formal labor law protection, and they're in the shadows, and that's where the higher risks can come. And we've also got to find together a way to bring those small independent workers, the independent businesses into the formal sector, and we've got to push governments to find ways to incentivize that to happen so that they can also come out of the shadows and have the benefit of labor law inspection and oversight as well. It's a complex issue, but there's a longstanding and an evergreen commitment on the part of business to be part of the solution.
And speaking about, and shifting gears very slightly about some of these big mega drivers of change, and recently the ILO's Future of Work report had looked at issues such as digital technologies, but also climate change. I think many of the audiences that are here today will understand that, climate change does have a direct impact on their work. Looking at whether it's too much rain and you can't plant the fields, or not enough rain, or the impact of fertilizers. Again, Cathy, on your side, what are the big challenges that climate change imposes on those agricultural workers, and what is the AFL-CIO doing with business in order to improve that situation?
Yeah, and I should have added that is one of the major crises, right? That I should have added to the list as we see what was happening to agricultural workers here in the United States and California. You had the pandemic and you had the fires, and they were out there, inhaling smoke from what we're seeing as an impact of climate change, these raging fires on the West Coast. The AFL-CIO has worked with the International Labor Organization, with USCIB and others on creating a just transition framework. We need to ensure that any worker that is affected by climate change has a framework for transitioning, for having health and safety protections, for making sure if they need to adapt in their workplace, that there's a government plan for doing that you don't just sort of say, this job is no longer needed in this economy, but have a plan for those workers that need a transition. I think agricultural workers in particular are bearing a brunt of climate change with the weather conditions. And I would say that a challenge is, how are employers adapting to the need to increase protections, right? We saw this as a real struggle with the smoke inhalation of workers. That was a case that was really in front of us in the most recent weeks. And so I think, having just transition frameworks for the needed transition due to climate change, you need the solutions to be tripartite. Workers need to be at the table shaping the policies needed for the future, needed for that transition. We absolutely accept we must be part of the solution to addressing climate change. Unions are in it, and we look forward to working with our business partners.
Great. Gabriella, if I could ask you the same question, please.
Sure. In terms of the future of work and this shared planet, right? There's no planet B, as they say. I mean, we're in this together. The UN Sustainable Development Goals provide a very important framework. I know you'll be talking about that more in later sessions today, but they are the global consensus on the full range of policy issues, including climate and environment and oceans, and poverty and hunger and women and children, the full range of core areas where we need to be finding shared solutions to advance. USCIB has a website we host called Business for 2030, where we list a number of examples of business efforts to and concrete programs and investments they're making in support of the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. The Sustainable Development Goal agenda and climate, as you're talking about, and we're talking about agriculture, and we're talking about worker, these are intersecting policy areas. You kicked off with future of work. Future of work is an opportunity space for all of us, and COVID-19 is only shining a brighter light on the importance of education policy. First and foremost, I mean, it begins at the early years, and education policy that's developed in consultation with workers, with employers, to understand needs, skills gaps and needs for jobs for the future. Inclusive employment policies to address the need for more balance of bringing women and youth into the workplace, apprenticeship policies and opportunities for innovative approaches in that area, older workers, disabled, talking about intersections, just, kind of as I was orienting myself a little bit for today's panel, I mentioned I'm the labor employment person at my organization. I'm not the food and ag person, but there's so many innovations that are out there. And I read and watched a number of videos about regenerative agriculture, which ties into this need for innovative approaches that are climate and planet friendly, that deliver improvement in terms of productivity and yield, to be able to have more products for the people, for the nutrition, as well as business and societal value. So I would say businesses concerned, businesses demonstrating efforts towards the solutions on climate, and these are intersecting issues that need attention.
So I'd like to go a little further on the SDGs, if you don't mind. I mean, for those who may not know, the Sustainable Development Goals actually are all pretty much intersected, and we're very fortunate to have decent work as central to that. I see Mark on, so we may be finishing up here. But just very quickly, what is the trade-off between introducing newer technologies and displacing workers? 60% or so of workers in sub-Saharan Africa are in agriculture. We may have food security, but we'll have unemployment. So maybe just in the last 2 minutes, if we can just get the positions on either side before we have to close. Over.
I would just jump in and just say, using that just transition framework, technology has been introduced to workplaces and into agriculture for centuries. This is not new. And so we pretend now that suddenly we're in this technological moment. Well, we've always been in a moment of technological change. Right now it's faster than we've ever experienced it. You want to make sure those agricultural workers are at the table, shaping how the new technology is introduced into their workplace so that they can be part of the solution. If there needs to be a change in the jobs, let that be resolved through conversations. And I think that's how you do it. You create a just transition framework so that it's not technology versus workers, it's workers shaping the policies for the best technology and outcomes in their communities.
And the last word to you, Gabriella, please.
Well, I'm pleased, Kevin, to be able to give the last word as one of agreement and consensus. There is a need for inclusive approaches to be able to make sure that workers, as we are transitioning to new systems or innovations in agriculture and beyond, that we're also investing in retraining and upskilling to be able to to be able to support them in securing their ability to transition as well and advance on behalf of their families and their communities. So include business, include workers, include governments together at the table, and that's what the ILO offers. And I think inclusive approaches are really what's required.
Great. Gabriella, Cathy, thank you so much for joining us today. Mark, thank you for the invitation.
Kevin, Gabriella, Cathy, thank you for both bringing the ILO alive to us, but also giving us that hopeful, that consensus that we've got to move ahead and make things better kind of message. COVID requires demands. There's no other way. Now we can take that direction, that inspiration that you gave us. And thank you again for Director General Ryder. We are so fortunate to be able to have this global perspective, which then has such a local and personal, because everybody on the planet is working somehow. Everybody on the planet is affected by climate. Everyone on the planet affected by COVID. So your sharing today at the both macro and the most micro level is a very, very important contribution to our World Food Day. We look forward to hearing more and following and partnering as we can. Thank you very much. And to our guests, we will be back to you in just a couple minutes. Thank you again, International Labour Organization.